were children running the Industrial Revolution? There is something strange about old photographs from the Industrial Revolution. Once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. Children, not one child helping his father, not a handful of teenagers working beside adults, but entire rows of children operating machinery. Children were working underground, carrying buckets, climbing chimneys, and in some photographs, the adults seemed to be the minority. So today, I don't want to talk about the orphan trains again. I want to investigate something much more specific. Who exactly was operating the industrial world? Look at the ratios. One of the photographs reproduced in Children of the Mud Flood shows workers standing alongside textile machinery. The author asks the reader to stop looking at the machinery and count the people. He estimates that in that particular photograph, there is roughly 3 children for every adult. Look at the image yourself. There are adults, but the number of young workers is immediately noticeable. And that creates a different question from the usual discussion about child labor. We already know children worked during industrialization. That's not controversial. The question is, why does the workforce appear to contain so many of them? The barefoot factory girl. Look closer at another photograph. There is a young girl standing directly beside the machinery. She's barefoot. Behind her stands an adult man. He's properly dressed, wearing shoes, and the visual relationship is difficult to ignore. The child appears to be operating the equipment. The adult appears to be supervising. That doesn't prove anything about a historical reset, but it does reveal something important about industrialization. Children weren't necessarily standing around doing insignificant jobs. Some were embedded directly into the machinery of production. The factory was not a place where children occasionally worked. Children were part of an integral operating system. Now, why children? The standard explanation is economics. Children could be paid less, they were easier to control, families were poor, small bodies could fit into places that adults couldn't. A lot of that makes sense. But another question is buried underneath it. For an economic system to exploit enormous numbers of children, there first needs to be enormous populations of children available. And Children of the Mud Flood keeps returning to this problem. Not merely why employ children, but why were there so many children to employ? 6 years old. The photographs become even harder to comprehend when you look at the ages involved. The document shows extremely young workers and specifically comments on an apparent chimney sweep who looks around 6 years old. Think about being 6. Today, that's a kindergartner or a first grade child. Yet, occupations like chimney sweeping historically relied on small children precisely because their bodies could fit through the narrow flues. Let's take a quick minute to just look at this footage that I found of a boy from the 1930s working as a chimney sweep at only 3 years old. And that's one of the darkest realities of early industrial society. Children were not cheaper versions of adults, their size itself became economically valuable. Coal mines had the same problem. Factories had the same problem. Certain jobs were effectively designed around very small bodies, which means industrialization didn't tolerate child labor. Parts were dependent on it and even built around it. Now, where were all of the adults? So this comes the question that interests me the most. Where were mom and dad? The author of the book that I was referring to asks us directly because when we're looking through collections of 19th century labor photography, you repeatedly encounter groups dominated by the young. There are conventional explanations, which were that adults died younger and families needed every member earning. Some industries deliberately hired children. And photography doesn't give us a statistically representative sample of every 19th century workplace, but the visual pattern is still worth examining because the Industrial Revolution supposedly represents humanity becoming more technologically capable. Yet the people operating the technology were mostly children, very young children. So that is an extraordinary contradiction. Another image in the document shows a line of young workers holding buckets. Their clothes are filthy, and some appear very young. They're standing together like a workforce portrait. Ignore the reset theory for a moment and just consider what the photograph represents. A society developed in an industrial labor system capable of organizing children into work crews. There were schedules, supervisors, transportation, housing, employers, equipment, payment systems, institutions capable of supplying and managing labor. So this wasn't random. This was all organized. And that's where the subject becomes a little bit more interesting because industrialization was a system of organization. So we tend to describe the Industrial Revolution primarily through inventions: the locomotive, the steam engine, mechanized factories, but machines alone don't create industrialization. Industrialization requires populations to become organized around machines. So they had to perform repetitive tasks, live near industrial centers, arrive at specific locations at specific times. And in this sense, industrialization wasn't a technological revolution, it was more of a massive restructuring of human life altogether. Time itself changed. Instead of work following daylight, seasons, and agricultural cycles, factory whistles and clocks determined when people worked. Families moved, communities changed, and traditional trades disappeared. And children became an integral part of this new system. And then something even stranger happened. This is where the children of the mud flood theory becomes more specific. The document notes that the relocated children arrived without birth certificates or identification. Their names would be changed, their family connections became difficult to trace, and within one generation, some could effectively begin an entirely new family line. And this is where the reset interpretation goes far beyond child labor. Because imagine the consequences. A child doesn't know exactly where he was born. His surname changes. He grows up hundreds of miles away. He becomes an adult. His children only know the new surname. His grandchildren know even less. After several generations, the original identity is gone, not hidden in a vault or erased from a computer, just simply forgotten. The reset doesn't have to destroy every building. That creates an interesting way of thinking about the word reset. People hear reset and imagine a giant catastrophe. Sorry if you hear my cat. By the way, he just had a surgery and he's not very happy. Yes, when people hear reset, they imagine a giant catastrophe. Cities buried overnight, civilizations disappearing instantly, but populations can also be reset socially. Move people, rename them, educate their children a different way, change their occupation types, change the institutions that they depend upon. Give the next generation a new explanation for how the old world worked. Wait long enough, and then the society on the other side has little memory of what existed before it. This does not prove the mud flood theory, but it gives the theory a much more interesting mechanism than simply saying history was erased. So maybe industrialization was the Great Reset. And this is the possibility that I think deserves more attention. What if the Industrial Revolution itself was the reset? Not necessarily a secret event or a government conspiracy, but a period where enormous populations were uprooted from older ways of living and absorbed into a completely different social structure. People moved from farms into cities, from households into factories, and traditional trades were replaced one by mechanized production. Children entered institutions and workplaces. Documentation became increasingly standardized. Education became standardized. Time became standardized. Even family identities became increasingly dependent on state records. And within a couple of generations, the structure of everyday human life has completely changed. Maybe that's why 19th century photographs feel so alien. We aren't looking at old technology. We are looking at people living through one of the most aggressive social transformations in recorded history. And for some reason, children appear right at the center of it. So the next time that you see one of these Industrial Revolution photographs, don't only look at the machinery, look at the workers, count them, estimate their ages, look at who's barefoot, look at who's supervising, and look at who's actually operating the equipment. Because one of the most interesting questions about industrialization isn't how the machines worked, it's how an entire generation of children became available to operate them. And what we're calling the Industrial Revolution may have been one of the largest reorganizations of human identity in modern history.